Awesome. So in learning about brakes today, I want to first start off with types of brakes. This webinar will largely focus on rim brakes today. And for rim brakes, for anyone that may not know, this metal piece here, this metal part of your wheel, is the rim. And as you can see here, or can you? So a common misconception is that your brakes are on your handlebars here. So if I want to stop, I pull these. These are not your brakes, these are your brake levers. It's a little bit of semantics, but your brakes themselves sit around your wheel. Whether or not they're rim brakes, if they're disc brakes, they'll be on the bottom part of your wheel here. And yeah, rim brakes sit on your actual rim. So if your braking mechanism is centered on your rim, you have you have rim brakes, and if you have disc brakes, you'll have a disc here. So even within rim brakes, there's lots of different types. There's several different types of rim brakes. So just so you can see a little bit better. So you can see here, the disc brakes have a rotor, and that is what, this is like a shiny metal piece here. Although for some reason it's depicted as blue. And that's what sits right around your hub if you have disc brakes. And if you have rim brakes, the three main types are these caliper brakes, cantilever brakes, which work by these cables pulling up, and V-brakes, where this part here is actually called the noodle, which is a fun fact. But the cable pulls sideways up and through here, whereas these caliper brakes squeeze up through here. And as on my bike here, we have caliper brakes. They make kind of like a U, an upside down U shape when you have caliper brakes. Cantilever brakes, like I mentioned, they have this sort of like V triangle with three directions of cable coming in. They'll always have this metal piece in the middle. And then V brakes have the noodle, which is a telltale sign. Awesome. So, so things that you want to check on your brakes. There is brake tightness, also the quality of your brake pads. And those are the two primary things you'll be wanting to check, and making sure that your bike is safe to ride, and keeping your brakes in good condition. So for brake pads, let's see. These brake pads, here are two brake pads. This one is obviously new and this one is worn. This is why we want to check our brake pads. You can see, so these brake pads will be specific to your certain type of brake. And here are the brake pads on my bike. They have the rubber actually sits in a little, what's called a shoe. So as opposed to this where the rubber is just integrated with this part here, with this post. But every so often you want to check your brake pads to make sure that they're not worn. The kind of the posts have metal that's integrated in with it, so you want to make sure that it doesn't get to this. point. You can see also a new brake pad will have grooves. And you can think of this kind of like the bottom of your shoe. When your bottom of your shoe gets really worn, all the tread goes away, and it just becomes really smooth, like this. You'll also notice with this brake pad, if you can see, it's not, the wear isn't even. On this side, there's still some grooves, and on the bottom part, there's still some grooves there, but on the top part, it's completely worn. So this tells me that my brake pads weren't adjusted properly. So part of it was wearing away, and the other part wasn't touching the rim at all. And this is really sneaky, because if you were to look at this on your bike, and you look at it from the bottom, like, let's see if I can get this. Like that, if you're to look at the bottom part, you would think that this brake still has a lot of life in it. And obviously, if you look at it from the top, it's completely worn. So it's important to check your brake pad from different angles. So look at the top, look at the bottom, and the other thing is from either side if possible. So from the front side and the back side. We want our brake pads, the most important thing is the larger the surface the brake pad has on the rim, the more stopping power your brake pads have. So a common thing that happens is that brake pads will get kind of twisted and worn, or they can be a little difficult to put on, and they can end up sitting like out from the rim, or in either way, maybe in any sort of plane. So they can be towed in, towed out, tilted up, tilted down. When you loosen your brake pads, there's quite a bit of motion in terms of the different planes that they could sit in. So the most important thing is making sure that it sits flat on your rim. And if you take a look at your bike and your brakes aren't sitting flat on your rim, at that point you'd really want to make sure that you adjust them. In adjusting your brake pads, let's see. Whoa. So brake pads are often held on by a bolt, like we see here. And this bolt controls the range of motion on your brake pads. So I want to loosen that brake pad. And as you can see, now it's rotating. It's really hard to get all of those planes of motion and alignment correct if you're just trying to hold this and tighten. So there's a trick that I like to use that is, in order to get your brake pads positioned properly, you want to use your braking power to hold the brake pad against the rim. And once the brake pad is against the rim, it can rotate a little bit, but you have a lot more control so that the brake pad won't, as you're adjusting it, it won't slip. So this holds it in place a little bit, and especially when you're first getting it tightened down. And if you can see here, I don't want my brake pad touching my tires. I don't want it sitting too far down so that you can see this silver part is the braking surface. My rim goes a little bit farther down. I want my brake pad to be centered in that braking surface. So when I'll pull this down, pull my brake down, and push this up and get it centered. Awesome, and I'll hold it in place with my brake like that. And this is still loose. If I let this go, it would wobble all around. So then I can take my Allen key to tighten this bolt, and I'll tighten it down so that it is just tight enough where I know it's gonna stay in place if I let my brake go. So still in place. And I noticed that when I was tightening this rotated a little bit, so I can rotate it. Usually it will be loose enough so that you can rotate it back a little. Sorry, this isn't the greatest lighting. So you can see here, it's not sitting flat on the rim. It's pointed up a little bit. So I'm gonna rotate it back. And that looks good. And I check it. You always want to check it when you're pulling the brakes, because what looks centered, what looks right when the brake pad is off of the rim, once it actually hits the rim, could be different. So it could look like it's in the right position, and then once you actually are braking, it's hitting lower or higher or in the wrong position. So now I checked that. Looks like it's in the right position. For the last part of adjusting these brake pads, since I've only sort of like hand tightened these, I want to, if I were to go in and tighten these now and not do anything, the torque, the force of this Allen key twisting will rotate my brake pads. So I want to use my other hand, to oppose that torque. So I'm going to put since I'm tightening this way, I want to put my thumb here, and I put my finger on top to oppose the motion on this side, and I make sure that it doesn't rotate. And I tighten it, I think a good rule to operate by here is when you're tightening any bolt, go to where you hit that point of resistance and then do a half to quarter turn further. You don't want it so tight that you can never undo these bolts again, because these, like we were talking about, you will want to change your brake pads, so you don't want these to get frozen on there. So it's easier to do them one at a time as opposed to taking off both of your brake pads and replacing them at the same time, because the other brake pad helps with the gripping on the wheel. If there was no brake pad here, me pulling this brake down, there'd be nothing to help keep this brake pad in place. So the best way to do this is one at a time. It's really important to take a look at, before you start tampering with your brakes, to take a look at like how they work and what the features are. For example, this is a V-brake pad, and if you get these, they come out of the box, they look like this. It has all of these bolts, it has this bolt and all of these washers and pieces on it. So you want to make sure that you, before you remove your old brake pads, you look at how they attach. Because if I just get this and I'm like, I've never put brake pads on before, I might not know how does this attach? Do some of the washers go on one side? Do some of the washers go on the other side? So making a mental note, it's a really great thing to do, to take a picture of your components or anything you're about to work on, so you have a reference to go back to. And a lot of times you'll be able to do this, like I have my front brake and my rear brake, so I can look at my rear brake if I need to work backwards. But especially for something like this where there's a lot of pieces, you can also take each piece off and lay them out in order so that you can keep track of what the order is. Awesome. So, brake pads. I think that is all for brake pads. Now for brake tightness. Most brakes will have a release mechanism on them, and that helps especially in getting, if you ever need to take off your wheel, it helps so that the tire and the rim can slip through your brakes. Every type of brake will have a different release mechanism. On caliper brakes, you'll see this here. There's a little lever, and let's see if you can, and that pops open to give me just a few more millimeters of space on either side, but it's enough to really make a difference and to be able to squeeze my wheel out. So I'm gonna see if I can get an example of the spacing. So you see that moves, the arm moves in, and here the arm moves out. Never use this as a way to tighten your brakes overall. If your brakes are too loose or too tight, this is not the adjustment point. This is solely just for quickly releasing some tension on your brakes in order to get your wheel out, or in order to work on your bike in some capacity. So, brakes will have what are called barrel adjusters, barrel adjusters are for fine-tuning brake tension. And then there are also the overall brake attachment point, which is for large adjustments. And so that brake adjustment point would be here where the cable is clamped. This is like where the cable clamp is. So I can pull this cable tighter, or I can loosen this cable, and it's held by a pinch bolt, which basically pinches the cable in place. That's a little hard to see here. Let's see if I can pull this any closer. Awesome, I think that's better. Cool. So this bolt right here is what is pinching the cable and keeping it in place. Little adjustments here in terms of the cable tension make really big differences in your brake tightness. So whenever possible, we want to use our barrel adjusters. This bike has, these brakes have a barrel adjuster right here. And so that's where, as much as possible, I want to use my barrel adjusters to make these adjustments. Barrel adjusters are a common system on your bike. You'll see them in shifting as well. They help with tensioning cables. So both your brakes and your shifting systems work through cable tension. And these wires here that run through this black stuff, which is called the housing, we refer to them as cables. When you loosen your barrel adjuster, so barrel adjusters are basically a screw. And when the screw is tightened all the way down, it would sit. Let's see if you can see this. It would sit flat against here. This is not convenient. So this metal part would sit flat against here, and when you loosen them, this screw, as you can see, moves up this way, and this gap here is created. So that means that very counterintuitively, tightening your barrel adjuster, so moving the barrel adjuster, tightening it down this way, actually loosens your cable tension. So you can think of this gap getting smaller when you tighten it, and when you loosen your barrel adjuster, it tightens your brakes. So you can imagine like having a force that's pressing up like this. So you can think of it as like this little expander that you're adding, and it's pressing into the housing, this black plastic part here, and creating more tension along your cable line. And even though, you know, you could turn this like once or twice, and it can make a pretty big difference in the tightness of your brakes. So I recommend playing around with your barrel adjusters and getting a sense of how, like, what minute adjustments can make in your brakes. So yeah, you know, screwing it out as far as it can go. So you see the bottom of the screw is here, and screwing it out as far as possible and screwing it in as far as possible, and seeing sort of like what the range of motion is that you can get from that. A rule about brake tightness is that when you pull the levers, if you divide the space up between the handlebars and the levers into thirds, you can imagine it being like slices. You want your brakes to be fully stopped when you want to be fully stopped when you're in the last third. You don't want your brakes to be so tight that you pull them just a little bit and you're already stopped. And you don't want your brakes to be so tight that when you're not even touching them, that your wheel can't rotate freely. So nothing should be slowing my brakes down or my wheel down. This should just rotate freely. If I hear anything, if I hear any rubbing, if I see any rubbing, that is an issue. And that can also have to do with your wheel being out of true, which means that the wheel is crooked, and so you'll hear sort of like periodically like a scrape as your wheel is rotating. But if you hear a constant rub, that probably has to do with either your brakes being too tight or your wheel being out of alignment in the dropouts. And that's another thing. The brake pad adjustments that I made were strictly because of changing the brake pads themselves. I've seen people, I think a common error is people taking off their wheel to change a flat tire and putting their wheel back on, and then their brake pads all of a sudden don't sit as where they used to be. And so people trying to adjust the positioning of their brake pads to match, that happens very frequently. And that just means that you need to go back and revisit how your wheel is sitting in the frame. And it's probably just not pushed up into the dropouts enough. So, great. But yeah, so you want to be able to, you want your brakes to be a way that you can moderate your speed. So not just for stopping, but for slowing. And a lot of people want their brakes to be really tight so they feel like they have a lot of control for stopping, but stopping suddenly is far more dangerous than slowing down. So you want to be able to, you know, slow down just a little bit, come to a gradual stop. Jamming on your brakes is never a good idea, unless there's an extreme emergency, and even then. So, like I said, imagine this divided up into thirds, and you want your brakes to be fully stopped by the time you get into that last third. You never want your brakes to be so loose that you can pull this brake lever all the way back to the handlebars. And people will ride like that. And obviously these are just general rules. Some people do like their brakes a little tighter or a little looser. It really depends, but these are sort of best practices. Let's see. So, in terms of jamming your brakes on, we have on the left side, we have our front brake. On the right side, we have our rear brake. We also want our brakes to be even tightness. And that is because if you only pull on your front brake, you run the risk of flipping over your handlebars. So your front wheel stops and the rest of the bike keeps going and you over the top. And so the front brake is the stronger brake out of the two brakes. And the rear brake, however, if you only use the rear brake, you risk skidding, especially if you're in any sort of like loose gravel or snow. I've done this before where the back wheel slips out from underneath you and you can fishtail in those conditions. Skidding more so happens when the back brake doesn't have a ton of stopping power and your rest of your bike keeps moving and your back wheel, even though it's fully locked, just keeps pushing along. And then that can send you into a skid, and that's not very effective in terms of stopping because you're still moving forward while your wheel itself is stopped. So you want to use, in most cases, both brakes evenly. And that is pushing on the brake levers evenly, but also having your brake levers even. So you can imagine if your front brake is tighter, it's going to engage first before your rear brake, which could be sort of the equivalent of, only jamming on your front brake and causing you to flip over the handlebars. So brake cables will stretch over time, and depending on how you're using your brakes, one brake cable might stretch differently than the other. So that's an example of a good time to use your barrel adjusters to make sure that your brake cables are tensioned evenly. And I wonder if you can see this. So this brake is actually much looser than this brake in this case. So these need a little bit of work. Awesome. Another thing that you want to check on your brakes are the condition of the cables. And for that, so you'll notice we have two cables here. One of these is a brake cable and one of these is a shifter cable. And you'll notice that the shifter cable is much thinner than the brake cable. They also have different endpoints or cable heads. So there are two types of brake cables, one for mountain bikes and one for road bikes. But brake cables themselves will be sort of a similar thickness, where, as you can see for shifter cables, mountain bikes and road bikes generally use the same type of cables with this sort of barrel, head. So this one you can see that I have here is a mountain bike brake cable. These cables really depend on what type of brake levers you have. The head of the cable will sit in your braking mechanism on your handlebar. And the frustrating thing is that most brakes have a different way that these cables sit. The cable head sits in the brake levers. So a good thing to do is find out what type of brake levers that you have and look up how the brake cables are threaded. But here, let's see if you can see it. There's a little window. Let's see. Oh. Let's see. This bike much before. Well, the brake cables are actually sitting inside here. So it might be kind of hard to locate. The best thing to do is figure out what brake levers you have and go from there. In terms of the brake cables themselves, I don't know if you can tell, but these brake cables are quite corroded. So they have that sort of like white crustiness on them. New brake cables will be pretty shiny and smooth and slick. And brake cables will come in a couple different types of material. It's recommended to get the stainless type. They last way longer and they're just worth it. And they won't corrode as easily as the galvanized type. And the galvanized type will be much cheaper, but it's in terms of the longevity of these and their function, stainless cables are worth the investment. So anytime your brake cables get like this, it causes friction in the housing and it will make your braking feel sluggish. And you won't necessarily notice it after riding for a while on them, but once you change them, you'll notice that all of a sudden your brakes are a lot more responsive, but it's definitely one of those things that kind of sneaks up on you. But especially after you've been riding in the winter or through a lot of bad conditions, or if you leave your bike outside, you'll probably have to change your brake cables a little more frequently. This is like a common thing that tune-ups that you'll have in a tune-up is that they'll replace all of your cables. And it just makes everything so much smoother. So you'll notice that as I was talking about on the bike, we have housing, and just as we have different types of brake and shifter cables, we have different types of housing that are brake and shifter specific. And that's because brakes are something that we want to be able to withstand force. So we're cranking down on our brakes to make sure that they stop. We want to make sure that they can handle a lot of that force. Whereas shifters are meant for efficiency. We want to be able to quickly shift between gears. We want the cables to be able to slide. We're not putting as much force on shifter cables as we are on brake cables. So brake cables have this spiral core, brake housing has this spiral core that helps with compression forces from pulling. When you can think of when you're pulling a cable, you're putting compressive force on it, and the spiral helps with that. Whereas with shifter, we want it to function efficiently and smoothly, so we want it to be running through the housing very smoothly. So we have this straight metal core. So always remember the shifters have straight, and the brakes have this spiral. So that's another reason why the brake cables are thicker, is for that, being able to withstand that force. We want them to be stronger. So something that you can do, especially if you're like in the middle of winter and you don't want to replace your brake cables, is because you're going to be riding them throughout, you know, bad conditions, or if they've gotten like a little sticky or something, but don't quite seem like they need to be replaced, is you can add a little bit of lubrication at the ends of the housing, and that will help this like friction. That'll help relieve some of that friction along the housing line. So usually I'll take a light chain lubricant, or like Tri-Flow is really great, but this Chain J, and you can actually just sort of pour it. I mean, it's equivalent of just putting a little drop like here and just running some up and down the cable, just like that. What I'll do, so on here, you can see that the entry point from my brake cables into the housing is around my barrel adjuster here. So what I would do is flip my bike over, such that if I'm putting any sort of lubricant on there, it goes into the housing. So I'd flip my bike over and basically hydrate my cable lines. And that can actually really rescue some sticky brakes. And after I do that, I'll just pull the cables and just pulling on my brake levers to help work the lubricant through the housing. And sometimes you'll need to give it a little bit of time, but I'll go through and I'll look at find all of those entry points and add lubricant to that. So yeah, that's a really great way to avoid needing to go to a bike shop when you still feel like you have a lot of life left in your cables and housing. Something else that's really important is, let's see, disc brakes. So we won't be discussing disc brakes today. The disc brakes adjustments are a little more complicated, but just overall in terms of brake adjustments in general. All right, another question. So if my rear tire feels like it's rubbing against the brake very slightly, the first step would be to adjust the barrels. Is that correct? Okay, cool. That's an excellent answer, or excellent question. So if one side of your brakes is rubbing, I would take a look. Do you have caliper brakes? What kind of brakes do you have? First of all, I want to make sure that my brake mechanism is centered, and I can look at that through, I use my fork or the back to make sure that this whole system looks like it's centered. The next thing I would do is check to see, is my wheel centered in my frame? It's possible that your wheel is just ever so slightly crooked, and so that it's rubbing on one side of the brakes. The other thing that it can be, if you don't have, so you can see that, yeah, this whole mechanism could be tilted one way or the other. If that looks good, if you have V-brakes, for example, some of it can be the tensioning of the brake arms themselves. Oh, how do we, check to see if the wheel is crooked. So the best way is to check to see if your wheel is crooked is to take a look at the frame and compare it to before we move on. So what I'll do is, unless you 100% know that your brakes are centered, the best point of reference is the sides of your frame. So I'll look at the spacing here to see against the rim. It's a little hard to see here, but when I'm looking at it straight on, I'll kind of look at these 2 points where you can see my fingers are between here we have the fork blades, these tubes here, and the spacing between that and the rim. And if that spacing on one side is different than the other side, we know that the wheel is crooked in the frame. And that's the same sort of logic as the back. The back triangle is even a little, you have 2 points of reference with the back triangle. Let's see if I can move this around. So with the back brake, you have 2 sets of tubes that you can use. So you have the chain stays, these tubes, or sorry, the seat stays, which are these tubes, and the chain stays, which are these tubes. And you want to look at the spacing between the rim and the chain stay, or sorry, the seat stays, and the spacing between the rim back here and the seat stays. Oh, sorry, I keep mixing them up. Chain stays here and the rim here. Seat stays here and the rim here. So you have 2 points to help you center. In terms of rubbing, like I was talking about with V-brakes, sometimes, so brakes work by spring tension. There's, so if you look at if you squeeze these brakes together, there's a spring inside here that controls how springy they are. And the important thing about brakes is that spring tension is even. So V-brakes, let's see, it's a little backlit, but so on V-brakes, there's this bit here, which is a spring arm. And when this is out like this is release all the spring tension. So if I brake, only one side moves because all of that, the other side, the spring tension isn't properly adjusted. So if it's rubbing, it could be that one side, that your spring tension is off balance and that one side needs to be tensioned. So this is just disengaged entirely, but on V-brakes, for example, let's see, there's a little screw here. I don't know if you can see it. And this screw here controls the tension of this spring overall. Tightening this will add tension and loosening it will release tension. And in tightening tension on brakes like this, it will move the brake pad further away. You can think of like winding the spring up tighter. So it'll move the brake pad further away from the rim. The other thing that's really important in diagnosing brake problems is if your rim is if your brakes are rubbing on your rim, is it on one side? Is it on both sides? And then what if there's any sort of like cyclicalness of it, is it rubbing constantly or is it only rubbing in one patch? If it's only rubbing in one patch, it probably means that your wheel itself, the rim, is crooked, and that we call that being out of true. So there's like, you'll see the wheel sort of like wobble. If you're looking straight on, you'll see the wheel kind of wobble back and forth because it's not in a straight line this way when it's rotating. And that just happens over time. Your spokes are what help keep your wheel straight or your rim straight. And if your wheel is out of true, it can rub in certain patches. And that will more often happen. You'll hear it won't be that constant rub. It will be just every so often you'll hear a rub, but it will be at the same point every time. So those are really important things to notice. Let's see. So when I go out, when the road is wet, my brakes sometimes squeak, but they seem to work. Is that anything to worry about? That's another really good question. So as long as your brakes are working, that's totally fine. Squeaking brakes can be caused by a lot of different things, and it can be really frustrating. And this is especially relevant to disc brakes. If the braking surface gets dirty, actually I shouldn't touch that with my hands, dirty or greasy, you can get squeaky brakes from that. So a lot of times the wetness, the rims will pick up stuff from the road, and that squeaking is just caused from that. If it goes away, if the squeaking goes away when your rims are dry and your brake pads are dry, that's totally fine. In which case you don't really need to do anything. If you ride in the rain and your brakes are squeaking and then after it dries they're still squeaking, the best thing to do is take rubbing alcohol and wipe your rims down with rubbing alcohol. And also if that doesn't help, you can also use a cloth as like to flood. I'm gonna use my mask for example, but put it on the cloth and then floss between the side of the rim and the brake pad, and making sure that you're getting that braking surface clean as well. Really, really, really important with disc brakes. Disc brakes are, I think, even more so prone to squeaking. And that's because they can get dirty. The rotors get dirty really easily, and people will accidentally like touch them with their hands. The oil from your hands is really bad for brakes. So as much as possible, we want to try to not touch any sort of like braking surfaces with our hands and risk getting oil on them. Much more relevant for disc brakes, but yeah, rubbing alcohol is generally the best fix. Squeaking can also be caused if your brake pads aren't sitting flat on your frame. On your rim. So that's another cause. Or they might, if it's an old bike, your brake pads might just be really old and they can get hardened. There are also different types of brake pads. A really common and well-used brake pad company is called Coolstop. And Coolstop has black brake pads, and then they have the salmon colored brake pads. And salmon colored brake pads are generally better at stopping in wet conditions. So a lot of people really swear by the salmon Coolstop brake pads, and then but they are softer, so you will wear through them more quickly. But it's totally worth it, especially if you find that your bike doesn't stop very fast in wet conditions. But as long as your brakes are working, I wouldn't when it's wet out, I wouldn't say that the squeaking in and of itself is problematic. It's probably just because of the wet and dirt and stuff. Ooh, there was something else about that. I'm forgetting. Yeah. Oh, the other thing, if you have an older bike, especially like a vintage, any sort of like vintage bike, especially if you have 27, if your wheels are 27s, they used to be made with steel wheels, and steel wheels are awful for stopping in the rain. I think if I could recommend, if you have steel wheels, I really recommend changing them, because they are so dangerous for stopping in any sort of wet conditions. You can check to see if you have steel wheels by taking a magnet and seeing if they stick to the magnet sticks to the rim. If it sticks to the rim, it's steel. If not, they're probably aluminum or alloy, which is what all modern bikes will have. So if you find that especially if you find that you have a particularly hard time stopping in wet conditions, and you have an old bike, you might have steel wheels, so I'd check that out. We have a couple more minutes. Does anyone have any other questions about brakes? So I'm gonna share this. This is sort of right before we go, this is sort of the questions that I ask myself when I'm checking over my brakes, so sort of the checklist. So here's the checklist that I go through. Is the brake mechanism centered? So that is centered relative to the frame. Are both brake arms moving and in sync? And that's what I was talking about with the tensioning of the brake arms and having the spring tension be uneven. Generally, if your one brake arm isn't moving, the more tension, the better. That's not always the case, but anytime you're having an issue with your brake's not like being springy, you generally need to add more tension. And as you saw with the V brakes, that was that screw on the side, the tensioning, which it has on either side of, on either brake arm. With caliper brakes, a lot of times the tension will be this bolt, how tight it is, and sort of, and that compressive tension can make your brake arm, if your brake arm seems sluggish, you can use that. Another thing is if you're riding in bad conditions, a lot of times especially in the winter, your brake mechanism will get corroded, and I recommend using something like T9 and spraying that in the mechanism. And that will help lubricate it and sort of like free up. I've seen some really frozen brakes, and any sort of like spring or metal bit on your bike really be rescued by this stuff. It's kind of like WD-40, but much better and made for bikes specifically. So, yeah. So just quickly in the last minute or two, are brake pads centered and flush with the rim, which we went over? Are the brakes tight enough, and can the wheel spin freely? And here are some more visuals of good and poor brake alignment, and towing in and out. Ooh, looks like we might have one more question. I am not, in terms of e-bikes and brakes, that is not an area that I'm as familiar with. Usually, just like motorcycles and cars, oftentimes I think anything with a lot more, that's going a lot faster, you'd probably recommend disc brakes. And I'm guessing that most e-bikes would have disc brakes. The only issue is that you can't put disc brakes on any bike. Your fork has to be designed to withstand disc brake forces. So, you know, you can imagine the rotational force is way up here on rim brakes and way down here, is centered down here on disc brakes. So definitely making sure that, especially if you have a lot of rake or like bend to your fork, that tends to not be as good with the rotational forces of the disc brake, but it's really specific depending on what your fork is made out of. Is it carbon? Is it steel? Okay, back to a previous question. If the wheel looks trued and it's sitting evenly but still rubbing, is adjusting the barrel an option? Is it, Ellen, is it rubbing on, you said it was rubbing on one side or on both sides? In the meantime, Ifra, how often should the brake pads be replaced? You know, it depends on how much you ride and if you live in hilly areas and you're using them a lot. I just visually check them like once every few months if I ride a lot. One side had the brakes tightened, and I think that they tightened too much, not much space between. If there's not much space between, if you're able to pull your brake levers and then you pull them just a little bit and your wheel is already stopping, then your brakes are too tight. And I would use I would start off using the barrel adjusters and seeing if you can get that spacing between see if you can get that extra bit of room through your barrel adjusters. And if not, I would go down to the pinch bolt. Here you can see it's here where the cable will the free end of the cable will stick out of, and try and adjust that. If it's only rubbing on one side, yeah. And the other thing with that as well, so on V-brakes, the barrel adjuster is way up here, this thing. Yeah, I'd say if your brakes are too tight, I'd be able to tell that through like how far can I squeeze my brakes before it stops my wheel. And if you can squeeze them quite a ways before it stops a wheel, then it's probably not a barrel adjuster thing. It's probably a brake arm tensioning thing. If it's rubbing consistently on one whole side, then I would think that it's just a minute positioning of the wheel thing. Cool. All right, and Ellen, I'm gonna send you my email address in case none of that, in case none of that works. And you're welcome to like send me photos or to follow up with me with questions. Thank you all for joining today. Next week, we will be going over the chain and the drivetrain and those adjustments. So hopefully I will see you all next week. Thank you.